Welcome to Alabama Gristmill. It's good to have everyone back for this latest episode of the Alabama Gristmill podcast. I'm your co-host, or Mike Causey, and with my co-host Donna Causey.
Hi.
It's fun to be back. We've got a fun story today. We're actually going to go way back in Alabama history. We recently covered the space race. Now we're going back to the other direction. So we're going back into the early 1800s of Alabama and how it was a kind of a Wild West culture back then.
Yeah, you think about the Wild West being out in Texas and Missouri and all that, but the Alabama was considered the West and the Western frontier during the early 1800s. So, because there weren't but 13 colonies, and they just went west and came to Alabama.
It was the true pioneer days.
It was.
Before we get into the story, I do want to mention with all these stories we're talking about, they're on the website, alabamapioneers.com, but we also have a series of books, Alabama Footprints, and it goes over in more detail all this historical stories. Well, I say more detail. We kind of created it in a more accessible history.
And plus, I put a lot of documents, the original documents or so forth, and pictures in there that you can see as well. So,
yeah, you didn't make it like a dry history book. It's kind of like, something you can quickly kind of read a little tidbit about it, similar to this podcast. And you can kind of get a little brief dose of history and without having to go into this deep dive into a large book tome of historical and dry. So it makes it a lot more fun. And you can find those books as a series, Alabama Footprints. Just search that at Amazon.com or any other online book like Barnes & Noble. And you can request it at your local bookstore and they can pick it up.
Libraries, too. You can request it there.
Which is my favorite. The price is right there. And I think you combine multiple books up into...
I've got one big book that has the first 4 books in it, and I plan to do the next 4 very soon. It's just finding the time to get all this done.
Well, we wanted to mention that because that directly helps out this podcast and the website and us continuing to do this. So if you're interested in that, it's a great gift to buy, great for a history lover out there, something you can check out there. But we'll go ahead and get into the story and tell us a little bit about the old Wild West of Alabama in the early 1800s.
Right. This is even before Alabama became a state in 1819. First, I'll start off with a little of the background of where we're talking about. Before white settlers moved into this area, it was part of the Choctaw Nation, and it was named the Russell Settlement. Even in 1816, when I'm talking about it, they were still there. The Native Americans were not forced to leave until the 1830s. So it's kind of the people who settled there were barged in a lot of times. They had a lot of disagreements back and forth. It was named the Russell Settlement first because a lot of them it was not really a town. The next year it was renamed Troy, and it's not the Troy you think of in Alabama today. It's interesting why they named it that. But after being located to its present site, it was renamed New Troy in 1819. And then the town was incorporated, and it's received its final name of Greensboro. And at the time of Greensboro's incorporation, it was part of Greene County. But in 1867, it became the county seat of the newly established County of Hale. It went through a lot of transformation regarding its name in a period of, about 50 years. A lot of this information comes from the History of Greensboro, Alabama, written by William Edward Wadsworth Yerby. It's a very old book. Some little facts to know about Greensboro is in 1907, it was reported there was an artesian well located 12 miles southwest of Greensboro on what was known as the Goodrum Place. It was considered to be so large that it furnished more water than any other place in the United States at the time. Greensboro also is known for having furnished the state with 3 early governors. They were Israel Pickens, John Gale, and Thomas Stay. Greene County itself was named in honor of the American Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene. Greensboro, though, in its early days, had a reputation for being a rowdy, turbulent place like the Wild West. It was a place where a lot of murders were frequently committed. And so they had a time in the early days trying to get justice because there was not a lot of justice around. Among the first ordinances passed by the Intendant and Council of Greensboro was to prohibit horse racing, believe it or not. down the middle of Main Street. What would happen is many of, as you see on many Wild West shows, these people would come in from out of town and want to break loose and enjoy themselves as they set up horse races up and down Main Street. And of course, it was kind of rough for the people who lived in town because, they were in danger of being run over all the time. And one time, they had jockeys because they were actual horse races, and they had jockeys, and a bunch of them were coming down the town and at a breakneck speed, and one of the horses flew the track and ran into a dogwood thicket, and it killed the jockey, it was said. So they were in danger too. Well, the gentlemen in town began to they had that ordinance going, but nobody was paying attention to it. So the gentlemen in town decided they had to do something about it. They had to stop all this because it was getting out of hand. And so they got themselves armed, and when they came into town, they met the men and told them if they had any races going on Main Street, they would shoot them and they'd shoot the horses too. So that kind of, put a damper on the horse racing for a time. In 1843, at the corner of Main and Tuscaloosa Street, there was a public well covered by a square shelter and a four-sided roof, if you can imagine that. So I imagine they had to race around that. That was kind of a problem. But it was a nice little place for the people to gather on hot summer days because there was a beautiful oak tree sheltering the well. But people were beginning to get their own wells, and this was not needed so much anymore. And the town council thought, well, that's kind of an obstruction in the street. It served its time. So they felt like, well, we needed to make it clearer and an easier pathway for the coaches and wagons that were coming through because it was kind of getting crowded. So they filled in the well and they cut the tree down. And they also, at the same time, there was another well a little further down in front of the Greensboro Hotel, and they filled that in too. But the citizens were just enraged because this was a favorite spot. And they just did not like that at all. So they wound up hanging a likeness of the intendant in effigy. That was kind of a common thing they did back then. If you didn't agree with politics, they'd have a likeness of it and they'd hang them and burn them in effigy. And that was the way they showed their disapproval of what the council was doing. On December 21st, 1833, there was a special election that was held. To kind of give you a little bit more about how the elections and things went on in the early times. This is kind of typical all over the state, but even besides Greensboro, they get kind of vicious sometimes. And a lawyer named John Street was a candidate during this election for Justice of the Peace. And it really became a heated battle between the candidates at the time. And a young physician named Dr. J.S.W. Helen became engaged in a quarrel with one of the Street brothers. And a fist fight soon broke out on the sidewalk. And, of course, everybody gathered around, watched it and all. And it was near the polling place, so it really attracted a lot of people. John Street, the candidate, came to his brother's assistance who was fighting with Dr. Helen. And Dr. Helen managed to break loose and ran into the store. And he ran in and picked up a couple of weights that were used for scales and shouted, "Let me get back at those blank scoundrels." And as he went through the door, he suddenly just keeled over and fell dead on the sidewalk. Everybody stood around and rushed over to him, trying to figure out what was to do. And it was determined that he had been fatally stabbed. The brothers who had been fighting him, one of them had a knife. They arrested the two brothers and placed them under bond and put them in jail. They were both indicted by the grand jury because they knew so many people had been witness to it. They saw what happened. The Street brothers were pretty wealthy, and they got Colonel John Irwin to defend him. He was one of the best lawyers in the area at the time. Tensions rose so high that a change of venue was granted, and the trial had to take place in Marengo County. Well, the trials, I say, because the brothers were tried separately. And that presented a problem, because since they were tried separately, no one knew which one stabbed Dr. Helen. They knew one of them did, but they could not determine which one it was. They just let both of them go. So they never got indicted for this situation that developed when Dr. Helen was killed. Another story goes that a man who resided on Main Street, he often whipped his wife, and he kept getting fined for it, but it didn't really do any good. you'd hear about it again. He'd whip his wife, he'd go get fined again. So some of the citizens in town decided, this has just gone on long enough, and they have to stop this. 4 men by the name of Captain John Cox, Colonel Scott, William Hopper, and Richard Hunter decided they'd take the matter in their own hands and get it stopped. So they got hold of a good stout rail, and they waited for the wife beater to come back into town. But here he comes, all bedraggled and everything, and making his appearance, and he decided to sit out in front of one of the stores and start whittling with a big, ugly-looking knife. Well, Captain Cox came up with a plan. He crossed the street, and he thought, well, he'd kind of get him involved and get him over to where the rest of them were. We started conversing with him, but he noticed that big old knife, and he's kind of figured out, well, I got to get that away from him first. And he watched, but he couldn't figure out a way to get it knocked out of his hands. So Colonel Scott realized what was going on and realized that was kind of a dangerous situation for Captain Cox. So he walked over there, and the man kind of looked up warily. He knew he kind of felt like they were up to something, so he didn't know what. But when he walked up, he caught the man off guard, and he kicked the knife as hard as he could out of the man's hand, and it flew across into the street. And the 2 men quickly grabbed the man that was beating his wife, and Hopper and Hatter brought over the rail. Well, they quickly attracted a crowd, and other citizens joined in, and they all managed to place the man on the rail. And he was held there securely while the men walked up and down the street singing, "Here's the man that weeps his wife." So he's totally embarrassed by the whole situation, I'm sure. And the man was finally let go with the admonition that if he did it again, he would take him out in the wood, and his hide would be worn out with switches if he ever struck his wife again. Well, that worked. The conduct was never heard from him again. And
well, that's pretty amazing how,
justice was
I just love those stories
him.
on how they served justice back then, and, and just say, we'll just take care of it. And, probably maybe not the best way, but it got the job done in that era.
Well, that era, they didn't have, you just have one sheriff. You didn't have a whole bunch of policemen running around to take care of it. He was outnumbered. So citizens had to kind of step in and take on during that time. There's some other side notes, though, about Greensboro that were kind of interesting that I found when I was researching the story. Did you know there was a dramatic club made up only of men in Greensboro, Alabama?
So like a drama club?
A drama club. And it was only men in it. And they would do plays. They would dress up as ladies if they needed to.
That's what they used to do in Shakespeare Day, too.
Yeah,
back in the Shakespeare Day.
They just didn't think of women, as citizens a whole lot. And then they'd come up with an excuse that, that was kind of insulting to it. And they should not put women in that. It was indecent to use women in those roles like that. Right.
Yeah. And that's one thing I've noticed, and now you've kind of expounded on, is the fact that it's really hard to find stories about women in history, especially in Alabama or any other in that era.
Yeah, I ran across a reason why, too. I wondered that, too. It's because they didn't mention the comings and goings of women a lot in the papers for a long time. And the reason why, it was the rule that the editors of the olden times, that they avoided the name of a woman in their publications. In fact, one of the editors, named Colonel John G. Harvey in the area, thought that no lady's name should ever be in the public print except on 2 occasions, which were when she married and when she died. And that idea stayed around for about 50 years. You see all this news about gentlemen and men and everything, but you don't see the stories about women.
How times have changed for the better. I mean, that's just kind of, being not even a citizen in that truest sense.
Right. They would use the excuse that it was indecent to put their names in the paper, but actually they were just making them non-people, in a way when you think about it. And it's sad because there's so much history that has been lost because of that practice that we'll never know.
There's so many strong women in history that, even in Alabama history, we've covered over a few stories there. We'll have some more that we'll be bringing up, but but I mean, a lot of them are gone by first names or legends or kind of stories that were just passed down and not, in a newspaper or things like that.
Right. It was hard. And there were a lot of women publishers, believe it or not, that went way back in newspaper. But they really had to stand out to get their name in a paper. It is sad that we've lost so much. If you hear of stories like that, please share them with me, because I'm looking for women's stories all the time. It's so hard to find them.
The thing about this story is it's just such a detailed snapshot of the early days, and some things, how things have dramatically changed, and then some things how they're pretty much still doing the same thing. Kids still race cars down the streets. They're racing horses down the streets, things like that. In the small towns. But it's things change, but a lot of it stays the same. The same behaviors and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting look and comparison of modern day versus old.
That's exactly
but
right.
Like you said, if you've got any stories or anything like that, please submit them. Send them in. We'd like to share them out. info@alabamapioneers.com is the email. And you could also do it on our Facebook page. Make comments there to these articles.
Yeah, please send them there, because a lot of times some people send me messages and all, and sometimes I can get them to the website, but sometimes I can't. If you put them in the comment section, other people will enjoy them. So put them there. So that really would help a lot. And
we also have a community on the patron site where you can actually comment and exchange information there as well. So we've got a lot of different places you can do that.
Yeah, it's under the community section. So share your thoughts and information there. It's really a good spot to kind of let other people know and connect with other people that may know more about it too.
Yes. And with that, we'll probably go ahead and wrap this one up, this episode, and we will see you next time. We'll let Red Foley play us out. Alabama Jubilee. See you.
Dancing round on his toes, throws away his crutch and hollers, hey, let her go, oh honey.